Welcome to Biblical Viewpoints, a program brought to you by the Churches of Christ and dedicated to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. For over 30 years, it has been the intent of this program to uphold the Bible as the final authority in religious matters. You have heard man's viewpoints, but we invite you to open God's Word and join us as we search for the biblical viewpoint.
Well, Drew, we've looked at Abraham, part 1, 8 through 12 here in Hebrews 11. We've looked at that interlude. Very interesting stuff there, coming back to the idea of sojourning, the idea of the vision of faith, being able to look beyond the here and now to that home, that permanent residence with God. And of course, that all ties into the struggles that the Hebrews are facing.
You're right.
And so he's going to come back to Abraham now in verses 17 through 22, which tells you again, I think, what a big deal Abraham was as far as faith is concerned. But he's going to deal specifically with the event surrounding Isaac.
Yes.
And that, I think, the marathon of faith, as I like to call it, faith's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And aren't we glad that God's going to judge us on a whole body of work, not a point action in time? Yeah. No excuse for those point actions, but what can he make us? Yeah. And what will we allow him to mold us into? And where Abraham started and where he winds up is just phenomenal. Yeah. And so we're going to see Isaac as the son. We'll see God raising him symbolically from the dead and giving him back. From that, we're going to see him as a type. We're going to see Jacob's manner in death, Joseph's manner in death, how they went about those things, and how faith guided that process, and how we ought to approach that as well. And then this all pointing to Jesus. And powerful stuff here. Got a lot to cover.
Certainly
I'm going to give it to you, and you can take off.
Okay, this is Hebrews 11:17. And I'll say this, before we get started, let me say this. If you are perplexed by how God could command Abraham to offer his son Isaac on an altar in Genesis chapter 22, get on the Elizabethan Church of Christ website and shoot us an email. We'll be happy to send you some material on that. We've got some material that we just don't have time to present on the show today, but we'd be happy to get that material to you if you're interested. Point number 1, though, we're looking at Hebrews chapter 11. The binding of Isaac is going to be pivotal in this. This is the climax of Abraham's faith. And so as we look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17, we read, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This is verse 18. "It was he to whom it was said, 'In Isaac your descendants shall be called.'" Verse 19, Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him, Isaac, back as a type or a figure. Verse 20, "By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come." Verse 21, "By faith Jacob, as he was dying," that's an emphasis, "blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and worshipped leaning on the top of his staff." Verse 22, "By faith Joseph, when he was dying," another emphasis, "made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel, and gave orders concerning his bones." So as we look at all of this, the big point here is about life from the dead. And he's going to start with the model of Abraham's climactic faith, which is his offering of Isaac. One of the things we notice, this is very interesting, is that in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 2, he is called the beloved son. Genesis chapter 22, he takes Isaac up on the mountain, and it says, "Take now your son." God regards him as your only son. What happened to Ishmael? Well, he's not the child of promise. He's not the child of faith. He was a child born out of Abraham and Sarah's intuition rather than a trust or a faith upon God. And in Genesis 22:2, speaking of Isaac, he says, "Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you." Oh, wow. So Abraham's put to the ultimate test. But it's not accidental that in Genesis 22:2, he's called the beloved son. When we get over to the New Testament, it's not accidental that Jesus Christ in a couple of the parables is also regarded as the beloved son. You look at Mark chapter 12, and it said that he is the beloved son in the parable of the landowner. If you look at Jesus' baptism, he says, "This is my beloved son." in whom I am well pleased. And the syntax there matches up, by the way, in the Greek Old Testament with the Greek New Testament. What he's doing is he's echoing back to say, in the same way that Isaac was the beloved son, here's Jesus, who is the beloved son. Now in Romans chapter 8 and verse 32, we have the same kind of strand spoken of Jesus by Paul, where he says it this way in Romans 8:32, he did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all. How will he not also with him freely give us all things? Todd, the first point we realize is that Isaac is the son, and we're going to see the connection with Jesus more and more as we go through this unit.
Yes, the whole event with Isaac is a miraculous thing too.
Yeah.
And there's this promise, and sometimes I think maybe God waits just a little bit to kind of see what we're going to do here.
Yeah.
You mentioned Hagar and that whole thing. That was a common practice in the world around them.
That's right.
They did that sort of thing a lot. And so conventional wisdom would say, hey, it's not going to work this way. And so they're trying to help God out somehow. Boy, what a mess they made, right?
Yes, right.
When you look at the descendants of Ishmael and all of the things that have happened from that. But anyway, just another reason why we need to trust him. And so it's also going to be a proving ground for Abraham as you go on and see God tell him to go and sacrifice this only son, this special son, this son of promise. What kind of faith? Again, I was impressed with the fact he'd leave his home and his family in Genesis 12. Now, how impressed do you have to be that he's willing to say, okay, if I do this, God's going to give him back to me, which is exactly what the Hebrews writer says about him. So let's talk about that, how God raises from the dead. Now, if you go and you look at the writings of evolutionists and all of that, they're going to tell you that we're a bunch of nuts because we believe in this supernatural business. And the whole idea of resurrection to them is just laughable. But I would offer you this as a little bit of a retort. They don't have a problem with a rock coming to life at some point in Earth's history. So I don't know which makes more sense, a mindless process by which dead chemicals come to life and then form all of this, or a mindful process by which a thoughtful and powerful God is able to give life. So they have no problem with non-living things coming to life. Just know that. But they have a problem with this. But God raises the dead. Death is not the be-all, end-all. Now, that's hard for me to get my mind around. I live in this body, right? Everything I've known so far has occurred for me in this physical shell which I occupy, but I know that it's going to go away. And so Abraham's faith was in a God who had promised. And so this is something that we need to keep in mind. I make promises. I'm sure you make promises. Drew makes promises. And I think, I know that I intend to keep them. I think Drew intends to keep them. I think that you intend to keep your promises. But here's what I know. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes it's because when I made the promise, I didn't realize just how much capital I was going to have to fulfill the promise. It's not that I didn't want to. It's that I wasn't able to. Or I have had times where I just became weak and gave up on a promise. Here's the thing. We have a God who has promised, and he will keep that promise. And Abraham was well aware of that at this point. Early on in his following God, he wasn't so sure. When he went down to Egypt, oh no, she's my sister, unless they kill him. If he had been thinking in the same way he was in Genesis 22, he probably would have said, no, that's my wife. Keep your hands off. And would have known God was going to take care of him. But nonetheless, this son of promise ultimately was to be offered up as a sacrifice. And this was a test that was given to Abraham, and it stands to this day as an example of the kind of faith that we need to have. And so he rightly concluded, because God is faithful to his promises, that he would deliver, that he would raise this one from the dead if necessary. Because he'd given that promise, Abraham was able to conclude this. And so I'm reminded of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9. He said, yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves. Paul talking about the difficulty that he faced, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. And we could say more about this, but Drew, I think that really encapsulates the point here, is so that our faith, our trust, our hope is in the God who raises the dead and not in any of these physical, temporal, fading, and dying things that we often put our faith in. Right?
That's right. That's right. Our faith needs to be in God. And that leads us into our very next point, the writer's very next point, which is that Abraham with Isaac, then that stands as a type or a model for two different things, and that's where we turn our attention to now. This is Hebrews 11:19. Todd's worked with 11:19a. Here's 11:19b, from which, so God's able to raise the dead, from which point he says he received Isaac back as a type or a figure, as a model, as a template. Now that's interesting. If you look at 9:9, he's said that before. He's used the same kind of terminology before. Back in 9:9, speaking of the Old Testament tabernacle or temple, he says that Old Testament thing was a symbol for the present time, which demonstrates the greater that's yet to come. Now in Hebrews chapter 11:19, he uses the same kind of word, and he says this. He says that Isaac was received back by Abraham as a model or a type or a parable or a figure. And the point is dual here. The first one is Isaac is a type for Jesus. In the same way that Isaac, who's actually never killed in the narrative, Genesis 22, but Abraham knowing by faith that even if he had been, God's able to bring him back. It stands as a model for Jesus, who though he is dead, is able to come back. Isaac typifies the greater, the better, the superior son, Jesus. Now, as an aside here for just a brief moment, there are a couple of points that need to be observed about Abraham's faith. In Genesis 22 and verse 5, he tells Isaac that we're going to go make a sacrifice. And Isaac doesn't know that he is the sacrifice. But in Genesis 22:5, the plural there is in the Hebrew, and it says that we will return. It's almost as if Abraham knew whatever happens on this mountain, God has got this under control. There's another point, and that is that Abraham at this point, like Todd's already pointed out, while he had wavered before in his faith, doubting God's promise, in Genesis 22, the promise is at his back as he's thinking, if I rid myself of the son of promise, God's not faithful. And he's not able then to bring the seed as he has promised. It's almost as if Abraham knows that he goes upon the mountain, whatever happens, God has already assured me he needs Isaac to make the promise happen. Whatever happens, God is faithful. And that's Abraham's faith. So the first thing that Isaac typifies is Jesus. But there's a second element here. Isaac typifies people like you and me, the faithful people in Jesus the Messiah. And the point is this: if Isaac, by the power of God, can come back from and have life from the dead, the point is made that while Jesus is the supreme and he's pictured out front, in 1 Corinthians 15, this model is used as the first fruits. But the idea of a first fruits, which is the first ingathering or the harvest, it implies the greater, the more. And it says this: Jesus is pictured out front as the first fruits, and he'll bring those that are faithful with him at his back. So Isaac not only typifies Jesus, the supreme faithful one that the whole cloud of witnesses speaks to, Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 3, but it also suggests that if we're with Jesus the Messiah, life from the dead isn't only something experienced by him, Todd, it's something we can experience too.
Amen. You pick up on that in 2 Timothy 4, verses 7 and 8, and then again in verse 18. Verses 7 and 8, Paul makes the declaration. Here he is, and you think about that. I mean, he's about to be put to death for preaching the gospel. And what is his primary concern? Hey, young man who has grown up in the faith around me, you see me about to die for the gospel, go preach the gospel I'm about to die for. And here's why you shouldn't be concerned about that. Come what may, the end is already written. It's up to you to make sure that as you determine the pages of the story in your book, between here and the end, that you end up in the right place. That's powerful. Yeah. And so he says there in 2 Timothy 4:7, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. And he says, therefore there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, and then he goes on to say that it's not just for him, though. Yeah. He will give it to all who have loved his appearing. And then you get down to verse 18, he starts reflecting back a little bit on the things that God had, verse 17, the things he had delivered him from, and he says, and he will deliver me from all things and usher me into what kind of kingdom? That everlasting kingdom. This one that's not going to go away. And that's what this is all about. And so, yes, the fact that Jesus was brought up from the dead, I mean, you get in 1 Corinthians 15, you take that away, it's meaningless. Just go on with your life. So anybody that professes to be a Christian and somehow doesn't buy the resurrection, I don't know what exactly they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Is foolishness, and Paul says as much over there. So that brings us to, though, and you can see that this is instilled in his descendants, right? Isaac, as he is winding down in his life, he's going to bless his sons.
Yes.
Okay, looking forward to things that were to come. You see that in 11:20. And then in 11:21, we're about to turn here, looking at Jacob's manner in death. There's something for us to learn from that, isn't there?
That's right.
So let's take a look at that. Jacob's manner in death. In Hebrews 11:21, the statement is made, by faith Jacob, when he was dying. Now, Drew rightly pointed out as he read through this the first time, there's an emphasis on that. When he was dying. Remember, the Hebrews are facing troubles. It may brew all the way up to the point where they're losing their lives over it. Many did. And so we got to be prepared for that if we're going to be able to remain faithful. And so our earthly lives are going to come to an end anyway. And so the question is an eternal question. What do we do between now and then? Well, when Jacob was dying, what did he do? He blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. And there's a pattern that is set forth in this. If we get over to Hebrews chapter 13, as Lord willing we will, not too long from now, he's talking here about the altar. You look in verse 10, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. For the body of those animals whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned outside the camp. So there's this parallel that he's using here of what happened with Jesus. Therefore, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. He gave himself up as a sacrifice. Well, to what end? Therefore, let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. That's what he's trying to do with this whole thing, is encourage them to continue. Now, you and I, if we believe in Jesus and we're going to be faithful to him, we may have to bear that reproach. And there's no telling what that ultimately ends like in the here and now. For here we have no continuing city. There we are back to that same theme. But we seek the one to come. Therefore, by him, let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. And so this worship that we have here, Jacob, as he is dying, Drew, he worships, I'm about to die. What do people often do when they're about to die? I heard a man one time say, if I knew I was dying, I'd go get vengeance on everybody that ever wronged me. I was like, boy, okay, and from that day forward, I was especially careful not to do him wrong because I was afraid to get terminal cancer. But anyway, I was trying to do him right anyway, but I was sure to do him right after that. But that was seriously his mindset. And I'm thinking, man, I probably would try to go find everybody that maybe I ever wronged and see if I can make that right. Hopefully I'm doing that anyway.
Yeah.
Some won't give you an opportunity. Some stripes we have to bear. Well, people react in a lot of different ways to the prospect of death. And so, but here's Jacob.
Yeah.
What's he do? Now, Jacob was another one. His life was a roller coaster too, He was the supplanter, right? That was what his name,
the deceiver, that's
his
right,
name meant. And he did some shady things along the way. But I think his ending was good. And I think there's a theme there in all of this here. It doesn't matter how we start.
Yeah.
Okay. You can start off great out the blocks, but how do you finish? And that's what the Hebrews writer is really wanting them to do. And all of these examples, it's just line upon line. It's stacking it up deeper and deeper and making that foundation more solid as you go.
Yeah. If we read this, we've got to do better. All of us have to do better about reading the subtext of the Bible, where it doesn't come out and say some of this explicitly, but when we step back and get the big picture and we read the whole narrative, Genesis is really good about this. We see big points like forgiveness with Joseph. We see development like with Jacob. He starts out rough,
yes,
but God has worked with him in such a way by the end, he is a feeble man who in the ending of his days humbles himself, and he's feeble, but he's worshiping God. And it's like he's reflecting back on a whole life. That's what God's doing with us. And that's the same way that he's trying to drive the Hebrews now. You need to make sure you've got the right vision.
Yes.
This leads us into point number 5, and that is Joseph's manner in death. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 22, it was when Joseph was dying. What's he concerned about? Well, Jacob was concerned about worshiping God. Joseph is concerned with something even greater. In fact, in Genesis chapter 50, 24 through 26, Exodus 13:19 says that this happened. Joshua 24:32 says that this happened. But let me tell you what happens. Joseph is on his deathbed, and he says, my bones, when I'm dead and gone, make sure my bones get back home. Don't leave them in Egypt. And so in Exodus 13:19, here they are getting ready to walk across the sea. And what do the people of Israel have with them? Moses leading them, of course. They've got the bones of Joseph. In Joshua 24:32, the bones of Joseph make them all the way back to the homeland. Now here's the interesting thing. When Joseph faces death, his concern is a real exodus, to get out of Egypt, to get home with God, where God always wanted the people to be. And so if we think about the exodus, I can't help but read this way. You tell me if I'm wrong. But in Luke 9:31, Jesus Christ is getting ready to make his own exodus. And it's speaking of the Mount of Transfiguration. Here he is, and he's talking with Moses and Elijah there on the Mount. And in Luke chapter 9 and verse 30, two men were talking with him. They were Moses and Elijah. This is 9:31 of Luke. Who appearing in glory were speaking of his, interesting word in the Greek text. You see if it sounds like something you know. Speaking of his exodus is the Greek word. Exodus is the transliteration, but you get the idea. Luke 9:31. They were speaking of Jesus' exodus that he was supposed to accomplish at Jerusalem. I think that Jesus' exodus is the greater exodus. And I think that old one in Egypt stood as a model, a type of greater things yet to come. Glance back at Hebrews 11:22 with me and see if this doesn't make sense. In Hebrews 11:22, it was by faith Joseph, when he was dying, he made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. If we're reading the subtext here in Hebrews, I think he's making a big point, and it's all getting ready to culminate in Hebrews chapter 12, 1 through 3. And that is that our God that we serve is able to bring life from the dead. He's able to offer us a real exodus out of a real bondage of sin and bring us home to a real home with him in heaven. That's the ultimate goal. And Joseph, I think, is seeing all of this, and that's why you've got people like Joseph, who's concerned about his bones and the exodus back to the homeland. You've got people like Jacob who are worshiping. But Todd, there's one person that maybe is the supreme of them all, and maybe he's the one we need to look at last.
Amen. Jesus in Genesis, or in Hebrews 12, 1 through 3 here, that's where he's bringing this whole thing to, and how we need to look to him. And that's a potent thing. As you were talking, there's something that came to my mind with Joseph and his mindset here. Whenever he is reassuring his brothers in Genesis 50, they're like, oh man, Dad's gone. What's he going to do to us now? And he reassures them. He says in verse 19, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. For what? In order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Those people died anyway.
Yeah. Yep.
So why was he saving them alive? And I think when he's pointing to that Exodus, Joseph has information that we needed to know. And that matches well with what you find in Acts 3, I believe it is, when Peter talks about the prophets who have spoken of these things since
even Samuel began, and forward,
all the way back. Of those things that were being reassured there in Acts 2 and 3, these were spoken from the beginning.
All the way,
And Joseph, no doubt, was one of those who received that kind of information. It wasn't just, let's keep them alive, because they're going to die again later. They're going to die later anyway.
Yeah.
It's not about maintaining these physical bodies, so there had to have been something bigger that was in view there, and I think that's what we're looking at. So yes, this brings us to an anticipation. Let's talk about that for just a moment before we bring this to an end. This whole unit here, 17 through 22, and as you flow on into the rest of this chapter, verse 35, there were those women who received their dead raised to life again. They were looking for a better resurrection, okay? And this is all about Jesus. When you come to verse 3, or verse 2 in Hebrews 12, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. He sat down. Okay, now Drew, I believe this is pointing to the fact that once his suffering was done, his work was complete, he went and was at rest then.
Yeah,
that
right.
was done.
Yep.
And we have a rest waiting for us, don't we?
Yeah, that's right. Hebrews chapter 10, when he sat down, it showed the finality of the thing. and said, the work is finished. And now it's our job to be in the Messiah who has completed the victory at the cross. That's right.
Amen.
This is our conclusion. What have we learned in Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 22? We've learned that faith has nothing to fear, including and especially in this unit, death. Faith's not fearful of death. Death is an open door to the next world. And that's what he's saying. But you've only got this kind of hope if you're in the Messiah. And that's what Abraham saw, John 8:56. He saw the day of the Messiah and rejoiced and was glad. And if we think about Abraham here, he was a faithful one. He offered up Isaac. You think about Isaac, and he was faithful. You think about Jacob, and he was faithful, and even on his deathbed was worshiping God. Think about Joseph, and in his last days as he was dying, he's concerned about his bones and the greater exodus that's yet to come. You think about Jesus in his moments of death, and he's weeping in the Garden of Gethsemane, crying out to God on the cross. But in none of this did he falter. He remained faithful. What are we going to do when our last days come around to us? Are we going to be like Jesus? Are we going to be like Jacob, Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, and live by faith? Or will we succumb to the world, give over to the ways of the world, and abandon Christ and not live faithfully? Folks, there's no other option than to have life more abundantly with Jesus Christ, John 10, 18, and 19. If you're not with Him, we invite you to reach out and find life with Christ.
We see in the first 6 chapters of the book of Hebrews a superior person. Then we see a superior priesthood, and then we see a superior principle. You have those 3 points, you have the book of Hebrews. The superior Christ to anyone that's ever lived on the face of this earth. He is deity. And a superior priesthood, the priesthood of Jesus Christ that supersedes any. And the superior principle, the principle of faith, the faith system that comes by hearing the Word of God.
During Hebrews 11:18, in the midst of this text we've been talking about, the writer refers back to Genesis 21:12 when dealing with Hagar and Ishmael being sent out, that God told him that it was through Isaac that his seed was going to come, was going to be called. And so how does that factor into the laser focus that is part and parcel to this text that we're looking at?
Yeah, that's kind of like I was saying. Isaac is then a model not just for Jesus. It's not an ethnic model. It's not a blood DNA thing. It's by faith. The descendants are people by faith. And that's what Genesis 12 is aiming at. That's what Genesis 21 is aiming at. That's the way Paul reads it in Galatians 3. You're looking for a family? He says, well, be one of Isaac's, be one of Abraham's, be an heir of promise, an heir of faith. But he specifically says in Galatians 3, you've got to be in the Messiah. By faith, we're all baptized. He says that in 1 Corinthians 12. He says in Galatians 3, we need to be part of the family of faith. It's the family of Abraham, the family of Isaac.
Amen.
We have heard the joyful sound.
Thank you for joining us today on Biblical Viewpoints. If you have a question concerning the things taught on this program, desire to enroll in our free home Bible study course, or have some other way we may assist you in your quest to know the truth, you may contact us at Biblical Viewpoints, 137 East C Street, Elizabethton, Tennessee, 37643. In the meantime, we encourage you to find a Church of Christ meeting in your community and worship with them. You will always find a hearty welcome and a group of Christians eager to serve you.